actually going to look at a very important part of the infrastructure, continuing our conversation on the infrastructure this morning, the digital infrastructure. So we have seen a flash of investment and Airbnb and other tech company rushing into Cuba. But the reality is that the digital infrastructure remain probably one of the most problematic in the island. So this panel will be really about exploring what are the opportunities for investors, but also will investors actually invest in ICT infrastructure in Cuba? Are there the incentive there? Are the incentive there? And also, what lesson can Cuba learn from other countries which have gone through this period before? So I'm actually going to be joined here by two very interesting panelists for their area of work, but also for their personal association to Cuba. So welcome Bill Guillermo Belt, who is Senior Director for the Consumer Technology Association. You can come now, Bill. And Doug Madory, who is Director of Internet Analysis at DIN Network. Welcome.
Thank you.
So my first question would be to you, Bill. And the question is really about whether you could give us a general view of what is the state of the infrastructure. But before that, I like you to share with our guest your association to Cuba. What's the reason of your interest in Cuba? Because that's not part of your kind of core line of business.
Right. So thank you for having me, and thank you to the Economist for having me. My name is Guillermo Belt. I work for a trade association called the Consumer Electronics Association. In reality, we changed our name last week to the Consumer Technology Association. But before last week, we were known as the Consumer Electronics Association. If you've ever heard of my trade association, it's almost definitely because you've heard of our trade show. We put on the world's largest technology trade show. It's every January in Las Vegas. We have about 6,000 press, about 170,000 people from maybe 45 or so countries over a 4-day period in the only city large enough in the U.S. to hold it, which is Las Vegas. I'm actually not involved in the production of our show in any way. The show brings revenue in for our industry, and the industry is consumer electronics. And part of the way we spend that money is to do advocacy work on Capitol Hill and throughout the world. And also part of the way we spend that money is to do standards. I'm an engineer, and I'm sort of halfway in between the world of public policy and standards. I've been working in telecommunications and broadband communications since the very late 1980s. Seems sort of obvious and self-evident now, but when I was 21 or 22 years old and started off, it never occurred to me really the enormous power, the human desire for connectivity. Again, it just seems so obvious now, but when I was a kid, it was not so obvious to me. Our need for communications rivals, really, our need for food, our need for water, our need for shelter. And we've seen this throughout the world over the expansion of internet and broadband connectivity over the last 20 years. It's really an amazing and powerful force, and it can't be stopped. It can be managed, maybe, but it is certainly not something that can ever be stopped. The question was, what was my direct connection, though? So, interestingly enough, although I have strong interest in this stuff generally because I care about broadband connectivity, I also have a Cuban bent and a Cuban interest. I was born here in the United States, but both my parents were born and raised in Cuba. My mother left when she was 19. My dad left when he was 24 years old. One of my grandfathers was a senior executive at the Cuban Power Company when he left. The other of my grandfather had been in the 1930s and the 1940s. He was a diplomat and a politician. In fact, my grandfather was the mayor of Havana in the 1930s. He was an ambassador to the United Nations, or to the United States in the 1940s. He was, for a short period of time, ambassador to Colombia, which is always an interesting family story because while he was in Colombia as Cuban ambassador, Fidel Castro was also in Colombia, and he got wrapped up in some leftist demonstrations by students there and in fact was arrested in Colombia and thrown in jail in Colombia. And my grandfather was the one who bailed him out of jail and flew him back to Havana. I think Fidel was around 26 years old at the time that happened. Among the many things, though, my grandfather did, by far the one that he liked to talk about the most was his connection to the United Nations. As World War II wrapped up, the world's diplomats got together and tried to think, how did this happen again? How did we have a Second World War after all that we had gone through in the First World War, all the death, all the destruction, and all the effort to establish the League of Nations to prevent it from happening again? And the world's diplomats concluded very quickly that the failure laid in the League of Nations. It was a structural failure in the League of Nations. And they met throughout the world for several months as the war was wrapping up. Ultimately, they all got to San Francisco, California. And for those that follow history, that's where the United Nations was established. And the UN Charter was signed. There were 50 signatory countries. Cuba was one of them. Cuba was by far the smallest signatory country. Cuba was actually secretariat of the meetings that established the United Nations. And my grandfather headed the Cuban delegation to this group that created the UN. So he signed the UN Charter on behalf of Cuba. So I've grown up as son of immigrants in the US, always surrounded by questions about normalizations of relations between.
Finally, here we are.
Yeah,
so.
And here we are, 54 years later. So,
Great. And you're planning your first visit to Cuba soon.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
So, just give us a general overview. What is the state of ICT infrastructure in Cuba?
So, and I think it's sort of well known. There's been a lot of writing about it in the press. They do have internet connectivity there. They do have telephone connectivity there. The quality of the service is very bad. Congestion of the service is very bad, which, of course, leads to quality degradation also. For those that do have cell phones, they are second-generation cell phones. You may recall that as GSM service in the U.S. or TDMA service in the U.S. We haven't had that kind of service in the U.S. for at least, I don't know, more than 5 years, less than 10 for certain. About a quarter of the population has at one point or another accessed the internet, but only at one point or another. Nobody should believe that a quarter of the population in Cuba has regular access to the internet. They certainly don't. About 3 to 5% of the homes in Cuba have home-based internet connectivity. Those numbers are dismal by almost any standard. So a robust, open internet network, communications network, whatever you want to call it, it's really an essential requirement for a vibrant economy. And Cuba doesn't have it, but I think hopefully we'll talk about this today. Getting to it is actually not complex. So there's a lot of space to make sort of immediate changes in the way people live in Cuba, the way they conduct their personal lives, the way they conduct business, their ability to start businesses, and their ability to reach out to others across the world with similar interests.
Yeah, and as we were discussing earlier on, I mean, it's really the infrastructure required also for other type of business, like, you know, if you want to set up a call center or back offices, you really need the connectivity, which at the moment is not
right.
there.
And even the last panel, which was the health-based panel, as I think many people would agree, even modern health requires a modern broadband network to survive.
And then my question for Doug, what are some of the things that needs to happen really to improve internet access and internet penetration in Cuba? But before that, I'd like you also to share with our guests your connection with Cuba and what you do with, because it's really interesting, and I don't know whether people.
Yeah, sure. I don't have any.
Any person.
I don't have any familial connection to Cuba. So I am a computer scientist, and so for my work at Dyn, we used to be called Renesys. We were acquired last year, and the name changed. So we study internet connectivity around the world. Mostly we're looking at routing data of how ISPs exchange traffic, and we sell competitive business intelligence that's derived from that data. The side effect, though, is that we have a very accurate and timely picture of the layout of the internet from a logical standpoint in any country in the world at any given time. And so One of the things that I started as a little bit of a hobby was to try to understand better the role that submarine cables play in internet connectivity around the world. And for those of you who don't know, any transoceanic communication these days is practically exclusively carried over submarine fiber optic cables. And for any island nation, a submarine cable is vital to its internet, and it kind of can't have a modern functioning internet and by some extension, modern functioning economy without a submarine cable. So a submarine cable for an island nation is pretty important. And up until a couple of years ago, Cuba did not have one. And so I had the story of the Alba 1 cable that goes from Cuba to Venezuela. The Venezuelans set up a company to fund and build this cable. They had a French company install it, and in 2011, around February, I think it was completed. And there was no sign that there had been any improvement. And for about 2 years, there was no word from the government, no word from the techs of the state telecom, and there was a lot of rumors flying around that either the cable was never built, all the money was stolen, or it was built and it's broken, or it's just connecting the governments of Cuba and Venezuela and it's not doing anything else. I had come across this story and wrote to one of these bloggers who he thought he heard a rumor that maybe it was active, and he wrote out to his followers. And he's like, does anybody know any way to test this, or is the cable up, is it down? And so I have got data on this on every ISP in the world, and so I could share with him some data and be like, no, it's for sure all still satellite. The difference between satellite and fiber optic is important to make the distinction that for satellite is cannot compare to a fiber optic cable. It is the capacity is far lower. There's latency, like the time it takes for traffic to get from one place to another, cannot be improved beyond a certain point, just due to physics. The speed of light it takes to get to outer space and back is going to be farther than following the contours of the Earth, and so. And it's also usually a lot more expensive, so you're paying a lot more for much worse service. And so anybody who has the option wants to go to a submarine cable, some fiber optic connectivity versus satellite, if you can. So it was important that they get this cable up, and so I wrote to this guy, and I was like, it's not up, and I would know, immediately. And so he wrote, and he's like, can I write this up on my blog? And I was like, that's fine, just cite me, and that's fine. And the next day, it was a headline in the Miami Herald that Doug Midori says there's no new news on the submarine cable story. And I was like, wow, there's really an appetite for this story. And I was like, all right, well, I'll set something up. The moment that thing comes active, I'll have a little program send me an email saying Cuba's got a new connection. So about a year later, that actually happened, and then we broke the story about the Alba 1 cable coming active, and then within a couple days, the Cuban government actually made its first comment about the cable, confirming the reports, with a caveat saying that even though we've turned the cable on, this doesn't mean that there's going to be automatically going to be widespread access to the internet. It sounds a little ominous, perhaps, but. So we got a lot of press from that. I actually met one of the directors of ETEX of the State Telecom of Cuba a couple months later at a conference in Colombia, and confirmed a lot of the technical details that I had initially written up. And I've been kind of a little bit associated with the internet in Cuba since then. And when December came around and we had the announcements about the beginning of the normalization of relations with the United States, I was getting a lot of questions like, well, where should we go now? What would it look like for fielding internet in Cuba? And so the first thing that went to my head was Myanmar or Burma, where there aren't a lot of examples of countries out there that went from total to somewhat isolation to joining the international community very quickly, and or a country that had nearly no internet or telecommunications infrastructure to fielding a lot very quickly. And in my mind, Myanmar was a good example, partly because the process they went through was very transparent. They had a very open bidding process. It was very clear what the requirements were. It was very investor friendly. There were a lot of protectionist requirements that are often done for telecom investments, and the result is that they had two winners of the auction, the mobile private auction, were Telenor out of Norway and Ooredoo, which is out of Qatar in the Gulf, and they each paid about $500 million for a license, just the right to operate in Myanmar, one of the poorest countries in Asia, and then they, along with that, they had to agree that they would put up on their own expense, build out the infrastructure to cover 90% of the population within 2 years in the jungle of Southeast Asia. This is a pretty tall requirement that they put, but it was still, because it had been such an investor-friendly arrangement, they were willing to accept this, and so I feel like that model, while maybe can't be replicated exactly, is something to learn from. It doesn't have to be a U.S. company. There's a lot of international companies from around the world that would pay a lot of money to buy a license to operate in Cuba, and then the Cubans could also. We've had earlier panels about infrastructure. For the telecom, there's a lot of examples where the infrastructure can be, you can require the company coming in to build the infrastructure, and they'll do it, and they'll, with the aim of, they'll get their money back eventually, and so that's maybe one of the few places where you don't require some big outlay from the government or World Bank. You can require the telecom to do this. So now, what's happened since December is what's been leaked out. There isn't a lot of open knowledge or a lot of public announcements about this, but it seems like Texas doing a deal with Huawei, the Chinese telecom manufacturer, to do fielding equipment and upgrade the national infrastructure, which is good. But I think one of the lessons learned out of Myanmar was that the state telecom there, which is MPT, just is not equipped or manned to do some rapid deployment. It's any legacy fixed line telecom that's been in place for a long time just isn't an outfit that's typically manned or skilled to do a rapid deployment of like 4G mobile services to their population, and it would be. For Cuba's sake, it would be ideal if the lesson was carried on, and Texas didn't try to be the ones to actually do this themselves. If they were to have outside companies come in and take charge, but if they're going to come in and put in their own money, then they're also going to want to know that they can get some profit back.
And I guess that's the question as well, Bill, as well. We were discussing earlier, on the fact that whether there is really incentive or interest for investors to invest in Cuba, because it's a very small market in terms of size. And
it is. It's a very small market. There's 11 million citizens. I'm not sure what number of those are, let's say, internet age, above, 10 years old, let's say, or something.
Or even 5 now at the moment,
Yeah, my daughter, sure. So it is, it's a relatively small market, but that said, as Doug mentioned, we know for certain that there are companies eager to go in and do business. Doug pointed to one model, which is, the model where a company comes in and builds the actual infrastructure, and that, of course, is successful throughout the world, and it's very common. There are other models, there are other ways to do it. For example, the government itself could be the builder of the backbone network and then lease capacity on it. It's a model used in Singapore, but it's a model also used in other places, including in parts of the U.S. That are underserved by traditional carriers, where a local government will build out a network and then lease services out there. So, there are other models also. There could be Cuba as a venture capitalist. That's a model that's been used in other parts of the world also. So there are several different ways. I sort of tend to believe, my personal opinion, that to get it moving semi-quickly, it'll have to be a kind of municipal broadband model, a model in which the Cuban government itself invests heavily in the infrastructure. This is sort of an opposing view to what Doug said. But I think that's probably the safest bet. I think that the risks for a company to come in are just too great. again, we know people are lining up to come in. But companies don't always make the smartest decision all the time. And in the world of telecom and in the world of broadband communications, it's full of the corpses of companies who have made very bad decisions, like that decision. Any of you who paid attention to telecom in the early 2000s would know how many companies have collapsed for doing just this kind of thing. It's a very common problem, but there are ways around it. But anyway, I sort of wrap up what I wanted to say was, there are many models of how to do it. And Cuba, the Cuban government, and of course people who might want to invest ought to be investigating all of them, because it's probably not going to be something we're very accustomed to. It might be a hybrid of systems. Maybe, for example, the Cuban government would build out a network in rural parts of Cuba, build the backbone in the rural parts of Cuba, and then in the city do something more akin to what Doug was suggesting. Cuba has several built-in advantages. The state of the network right now is so bad that it's almost what we would call greenfield. We don't have to worry too much about protecting the existing infrastructure. And that's a huge problem in advanced nations. It's not a problem in Cuba. So that's one advantage. It has another advantage, which is about a third or so of their population lives in the top 5 cities.
So that's easier in terms of
2 years.
Yeah.
You could serve a third of the population. It's difficult and it's expensive, and it's important to serve rural parts of the country, of course. But right off the bat, you could be serving a third of the country just by providing services in 5, what are by American standards 5 small cities, or by most of the world's standards. So it has some built-in advantages already.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you were both saying. There is a component which is obviously a technical component, but there is also the kind of political component, because in a way, what you were mentioning, Doug, is like in Myanmar, there was actually an intention to kind of build competition and let competition basically work. Is it going to happen in Cuba, or is it? I mean, there are lots of other issues related to connectivity, because connectivity also obviously comes with more information also available and more connectivity between citizens. Do you think there is? What are the political reflection of all that?
Doug and I were talking before this panel started. I think we agree that the situation in Cuba and the solution is a political one. It is not a question of enough engineers or enough equipment or even of companies wanting to rush in and build out networks. It really is a question of political will. As recently as just a few months ago, I can't remember, but I'm going to say about 6 months ago, the vice president of Cuba, while signing a document at the United Nations, which I'll talk about in a minute because I think it's a very interesting document, but at the same moment as he was doing that, he spoke about the fear of imperialists using an open and free telecommunications network in Cuba to finally put an end to the revolution. And in that environment where the vice president of a country is making statements like that, I don't know what kind of businessman would say this is the right place for me to put in equipment and build a network. It's important to remember that Cuba nationalized its telecommunications network at least twice, possibly 3 times, since 1959. And in today's dollars, billions and billions and billions of dollars in equipment was stolen. And we have short memories, and businessmen have even shorter memories. But shame on them, shame on them if they do it. So I really do think it is a question of political will. The little we know about this is generally the sort of old guard in Cuba has these traditional fears that are associated with dictatorships and the natural conflict between a dictatorship and open and free communications. But it's also true that Cuba is full of progressive people who recognize that open, modern telecommunications networks, internet networks, are absolutely critical components to a thriving economy. And if not already, those people will eventually sort of outnumber, the old guard. And as we were saying before, certainly if you're 20 years old or less than 20 years old, none of this junk that I'm mentioning matters to you. You don't think about this stuff at all. It's just about getting the services and going on with your life in a way that you can take advantage of what it feels like a miracle if you've never had it.
What's your view, Doug, more in terms of the opportunities and really the uptake from investors? I mean, of the opportunities in Cuba, already investing in Cuba. I'd like to hear a scoop we can use tomorrow in the Economist. Some new information.
Yeah. Okay.
Same as the ALBA.
Yeah. I guess I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know the particulars of people who have invested. But I guess I would say that maybe another model to go off of, because the comparisons are kind of helpful to illustrate what's the realm of the possible. Not that far away is Haiti. It's a poorer country.
Yes.
However, has a far more vibrant internet. And it's purely just policy that makes the difference between the two. So you have in Haiti, you have Access. There's a lot of U.S. investors are involved. There's Digicel, which is, we'll say it's multinational because it's it's in a lot of places. And even the national operator, after the earthquake, was bought by Viettel, which is a telecom out of Vietnam. It's actually the military of Vietnam owns Viettel and runs Viettel. Mm-hmm. And Viettel has a very high appetite for risk. They go and buy in very risky cases. They're actually a super interesting company if you follow the business of global telecoms. And so when right after the earthquake, they're like, we can get this for a steal, and they operate the national operator in Haiti. So there's local content also, like there's Netflix servers, there's content delivery networks are present. Google Global Cache servers are in Haiti. That's another missing component to what would make for a vibrant internet in Cuba. Aside from the international capacity link, which, let's say the submarine cable is going to satisfy that at least until they grow out of it, perhaps, and need a second cable. But having content positioned locally makes a big difference. So what Google does is they have these Google Global Cache servers that they are embedded in basically ISPs. Almost every ISP in the world has got this. There's only a handful of countries that don't have these things. Cuba is one that it's not present in. And what it does is basically it caches YouTube traffic. And so if there's going to be a video that gets watched 1,000 times in Cuba, it just downloads it once and then it serves it up locally 1,000 times versus pulling it 1,000 times over the cable. And video is very traffic intensive. Mm-hmm. And so that local content is going to be a critical thing. So that has to be kind of legal in some way that U.S. Content providers can actually put their equipment there and serve their equipment locally, and then there's the last mile question of access. And so I propose for rapid deployment of service, putting up mobile towers, just skipping ahead to 4G, like the Myanmar model is one way to go. Now, Bill mentioned broadband for fixed line. That doesn't address the fixed line. If you're going to be a business, you're not going to run that off the back of a cell phone, right? So you're going to need a fixed line, and that's a separate thing. That would require investment to actually get that installed. But and that's a concern for businesses trying to operate or have some sort of a location in Havana.
Thanks.
I can answer a couple of the quick, real quick.
Let's see first.
Yeah, sure.
Question in the. Question. Oh, there is one. Please, if you can introduce yourself briefly.
My name is Charles Ferrer.
Just wait for the.
Oh. I'm in Alcatel, country senior officer in La Habana. I share that connectivity is a political will, but a real issue is as well embargo. As you know, if you want to set up modern infrastructure, it's full of IT systems, and IT systems are today forbidden for Cuba. So what's happening with the opening today is a real opportunity to develop the country. But what do you think about this issue?
I guess I'm not the OFAC guy, but I think I know that part of the agreement in December was a relaxation on telecommunications networking equipment gear. So I'm not an expert on that, but that may have. In 2009 there was a relaxation as far as just being able to run another submarine cable to Cuba. Nobody ever did it because the Venezuelans did the other cable. But the irony, I think, of all of this is that, as far as the internet goes, is that after the announcement in December, where there was a pledge from the Cubans to expand access to the internet, it looks like Texas is going to go to Huawei to field their equipment, and this is all stuff they could have done at any time, right? There wasn't a restriction on that, and so the agreement with the United States may drive them to get the gear from Cuba, but they get it from wherever they want as long as they can expand internet access. I think U.S. interests are well served.
So we have 4 very interesting questions. Which one to choose? So I will go for the one that is the most liked. Will the Cuban government censor access to the internet?
I mean, it does presently.
Yeah.
I would expect that to continue.
That was an easy one.
Okay. I don't have that much else to add. Maybe it'll get better, but
or worse.
Yeah, I guess. And then number 2 is
number 2 is an interesting one.
So there's been discussion about a second submarine cable to go to Guantanamo Bay. Presently, Guantanamo Bay is connected via satellite, and there was an announcement that the DoD would run another cable from Florida to Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. And there was a statement at one point it actually came out in some tribunal or trials in Gitmo that this cable was intended to have capacity that would actually serve the country versus just the base, and that one day when things were better, the Gitmo cable would then also be another way to serve Cuba, which is kind of like another richly ironic kind of a thing if that were to take place. But I guess at present that's not. The cable doesn't exist. It's planned. These things don't sneak up on you overnight. They're years in the making. So.
And as I mentioned earlier, serving the top 5 cities is a quick and easy thing to do, and would get you a third of the population. And for those that don't know, Guantanamo it's in the top 5. Yeah,
of course. So we kind of don't have much time left, but I think it's quite interesting, maybe for you, Bill, the last question, which is, I guess, what's the point of all of us here? What specifically can U.S. telecom companies offer that Chinese company can't offer?
And I think that's a great question. I'm not sure that there's an easy and obvious answer. Even American companies, it's hard to tell what American company is really an American company, since equipment almost always exclusively made in Europe. And so I don't even know how you tell what amounts to an American company in the world of internet, in the world of broadband. But there are obvious things that we have, super obvious things. The distance between our countries is 90, 91 miles. That's an obvious benefit. We're on the same time zone as Doug was mentioning earlier when he and I were speaking. It's actually becoming more and more critical in the world of the internet. And so, of course, Cuba's on the same time zone as the East Coast of the U.S. That's helpful. There are a couple million now descendants like myself who are Cuban Americans who live in the U.S., most of which are in South Florida, again, 90 miles away from Cuba. So we have these sort of built-in natural connections that, in fact, our countries have had for 200 years.
For many years.
Yeah. Beyond those kind of sort of obvious things, I can't think of any reason why you would choose, how you balance buying your equipment from Alcatel-Lucent or Ericsson or Huawei. And by the way, none of those are American companies anyway.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah. Doug, any word of wisdom to finish the panel?
On that, I guess I bet Cisco or Juniper would argue that there's technical reasons why their equipment is better. As from a consumer standpoint, Cuba being a consumer, that they would want any of the options that they can have.
That's right.
There's also a larger resale market, so maybe a secondary market for equipment that's now, like just to have the full range of options of equipment to buy. I think they would probably appreciate to be able to have access to all of it. Now, I guess presently they do, but I know that there is. So I spoke at a conference earlier this year about the internet in Cuba. It was looking at outsourcing. It's an organization that does outsourcing to Latin America, and Cuba is of a high interest, where they look at Cuba and say there's a very high literacy rate, very educated population with very low salaries. So this is like a prime market to get into, and they would love to offer offer employment to Cubans if they can find a way to legally do it. If they could solve all the legal things, then the next thing is just do they have communications. And when the organizers of the conference later told me that they had a meeting with the Cuban delegation to the UN the following day, and they said that they were up front with saying that they were very there's a lot of paranoia about what could this be used to destabilize the government? Could and I'm glad they were honest with their concerns, but I think there is. In the telecom space, the internet space, the age of Snowden, maybe this is some of it's well placed, but there is, without a doubt, a lot of paranoia of U.S. equipment, U.S. companies in Cuba, and that'll take a lot to get over, probably.
I guess so, but I guess we are starting this process in different fields. So hopefully by next year, if we have the same summit, we'll see more progress. Hopefully.
I hope so.
Maybe in the Havana. Thanks so much. Our time is up. So just thanking my panelists. I think it was very insightful.